Welcome to Home Learning. This is computer science and the topic today is translators. In this lesson, there'll be an activity on translators that Mr. Barnes will go through, followed by exam questions with a full review. Over to Mr. Holton, who's going to explain what translators are and how it all works.
Okay, so let's try and cover translators in about 2 minutes. Translators is all about moving from high-level code into machine code or low-level code into machine code using a translator. So an example of high-level code would be something like this. And it's all about translating that into a language that the computer understands, and the only language that a computer understands is binary or machine code, which is just a sequence of zeros and ones. And there's a couple of ways of translating high-level code. The first way is called using a compiler. This takes your source code and compiles it all in one go, and it produces a file, which you then send to somebody to run on their computer. And when they run it, it produces machine code because it's already been turned into it. Another way is using something called an interpreter. This is a little bit different. So with an interpreter, you need to distribute the interpreter to the user, but you also need to distribute your source code, which can be a bit of a problem. What the user needs to do is take the source code and the interpreter and run them together to produce the machine code that is actually made as you run the program. So it's all done on the fly. The main advantage for your compiler is that you don't have to distribute your source code. So if you've spent 2 to 5 years creating a game and perfecting code to make that game, you don't have to give that away for free to your customers. That's a massive advantage. Compiled files also tend to be faster as well because there is a cost to interpreting code at runtime. However, if you make a mistake, you have to recompile all your code, which can take some time. The main advantage of using interpreters is that if there's any problems with your code, they can be found at runtime. So your program will stop and it will tell you exactly where your error is. This is why program languages like Python are very useful to learn how to code. Also, if I make a change to my code, then I don't need to recompile it because it's all interpreted on the fly. So it's very quick to make changes. As well as high-level code, there is low-level code. This uses something called mnemonics, which are very short sort of words which stand for something like add or sto for store, and then they usually have a number after them, usually in hexadecimal. Each line of low-level code translates almost directly to one line of machine code. This low-level code and all low-level code that you need to know about is called assembly. So how do we assemble assembly into machine code? Well, we use an assembler. And that is translators covered in just over 2 minutes.
Now we're going to go over to Mr. Barnes to review that worksheet.
Okay, so let's have a look at the answers to this sheet on programming languages and translators. So the first question was, which of the following examples of translators? We've got compiler, editor, interpreter and execution. So it's 2 marks, so let's go for compiler and interpreter. And they're the 2 types that convert high level into machine code. So next one up, some code is written using short commands, mnemonics, that correspond with instructions that the processor can carry out. So short commands might be LDA, SUB, ADD, things like that to signify load, add, subtract. So what type of code does this? Well, it's low-level language, which is known as assembly code. So next one up then, explain why using an interpreter is better to use than a compiler for a student learning how to use a program. So if we remember the characteristics of interpreter, an interpreter will check the code line by line, and if it or translate the code I should say line by line, and if it finds an error it will stop on that line. So if you're learning how to code, it would be really useful to know where the errors are, and an interpreter will do that because it will just stop when it finds an error. So we've got 2 marks here. So the first one, we need to say that an interpreter allows the student to translate and test code line by line. There we go, we've got 1 mark. This makes it easier as it will stop on the line where an error is, making it easier to find errors. Okay, so an interpreter allows the student to translate the code line by line. This makes it easy as it will stop on the line where the error is, making it easier to find errors. Okay, moving across to the second part then. So we've got to fill in the blanks, all the words down the bottom to make it a little bit easier. So a blank is a program that is able to convert high-level language commands into blank commands. Now, there are in theory, a few answers this first one could be, because you could say compiler, interpreter, or translator. But if you work through the rest of the sheet, you'll realise that the answer for this one has to be translator. So a translator is a program that is able to convert high-level language commands into machine code commands. So let's get rid of machine code and let's get rid of translator. This means that a high-level language can be used with on different CPUs or machines. Okay, so by using high-level language, you can use it on different machines. If you're using assembly language, that limits the types of CPUs, because a lot of them are specific to that CPU. Okay, so our next one is blank is used to convert blank commands into machine code. Okay, so again, if we have to read ahead here, because it will say it will translate blank of the code at once and produce a list of blank at the end. So if it's producing something at the end, that means it's going to have to have done everything, or translated everything rather, and therefore we are talking about a compiler. So a compiler is used to convert high-level language commands into machine code, and with a compiler it translates all of the code at once and produce a list of errors at the end if there are any. So compilers translate all the code at once and give you a list of errors at the end. Once this has been done, the code can then be used on other machines without needing a translator again, as it creates an executable. Okay, so when something's been compiled, it will normally create an exe file, so that you can then take the exe file, put it on another computer and just run it like a normal program without needing a translator to run it. And then that leaves our other type of translator. So an interpreter is used to convert blank language commands into machine code. Well, just like compiler, that is high level. It will translate blank of code at a time. So as we established over here on the previous question, it will translate one line of code at a time and let you know if any errors are found. This makes it easier to debug, as we found out with the last question. The translator is needed on the machine each time it is run, as the blank program isn't translated whole program. Okay, because it does it line by line, it never compiles it all together and creates that executable. So there we have it. There are your answers for this worksheet and the reasons why. Let's move on.
So this time I'm going to look at some exam questions that could be asked on translators. As always, Mr. Barnes will review these After you've completed them, you've got 10 minutes. Time's up. Let's see how you did. Mr. Barnes is going to review them. Please make sure that you assess them as you go.
Okay, so now you've had a go at these exam questions, let's go through, model the answers, and then look at the mark scheme. So, first question, Harry is planning to create a computer game using a high-level programming language. Remember, that's languages that are like the English language. State why the computer needs to translate the code before it's executed. So, what we need to think here is, if high level is the English language, or similar to the English language, why can a computer not understand it? Well, that's because it uses binary. So we can say this is because the computer can only understand and I'm not going to write binary, I'm going to write the type of language that binary is, and it's called machine code. Okay, so if we have a look at this answer and the mark scheme to go with it, here it says you can say it needs to convert it to binary or machine code, or you can say the processor can only understand machine code. So mine meets that second marking criteria for 1 mark. Okay, moving on. So Harry can use either a compiler or an interpreter to translate the code. Describe 2 differences between how a compiler and an interpreter would translate Harry's computer game. So, 4 marks. We need 2 comparisons or 2 differences between compilers and interpreters. So, the first thing I would always go for in this answer is how it translates code. So I'm going to say a compiler translates all the code at once, whereas an interpreter translates 1 line at a time. Okay, so there's the first part of my answer. Now, that gives me 2 marks, okay, because I've said how a compiler does something and then how an interpreter does it. So I need 1 more point. So the other point that I'm going to go for is to do with how it creates an executable file, or whether it creates an executable file. So I'm going to say a compiler creates an executable file so it can be run without a translator in future, whereas an interpreter does not. Okay, so let's have a look at our mark scheme and see how that pans out. So here we've got compiler translates all the code in one go, and I've said at once, so there's 1 mark, first point met. Whereas an interpreter translates 1 line at a time. Well, whereas an interpreter translates 1 line at a time. Perfect. The compiler creates an executable file. Compiler creates an executable so that it can be run without a translator in future, whereas an interpreter does not. Bang. 4 marks. The other thing in the mark scheme that could have been said is a compiler reports all the errors at an end, whereas the interpreter stops when it finds an error. And remember, that's a reason why it's useful for people learning to program for an interpreter. Okay, moving on to the final question. Okay, so we've got here describe 2 methods of translating high-level code into machine code. So first of all, you need to remember the 2 methods. The 2 translators. So simply we could write compiler and interpreter. And by writing that, it would actually get us 2 marks. Okay, so half marks just by writing 2 words. Now, because it says describe, we need to say how they work. So I'm going to say a compiler, this translates all the high-level code at once. And for an interpreter, I'm going to say this translates the high-level code line by line. Now, it doesn't seem like there's been a lot written and there's a lot of lines there. However, I think that gives me 4 marks. So let's have a look. If I just push this up. Okay, so for the final question, we've got here compiler, 1 mark. Translates all the code in one go, all at once. Translates all the high-level code at once. 2 marks. And then I've got interpreter. This translates a high-level code line by line. Translates the code line by line. 4 marks. And there we've got some perfect answers. The other things you could have said is a compiler produces an executable file, so it doesn't need to be compiled again. For an interpreter, we could say it needs to be translated every time it's run. There we go.
And that's it for translators. Stay tuned for the next lesson.